Jason, when we started talking around how do we support people going through kind of addiction recovery, we had a bit of a conversation about what addiction actually means. And I think it goes far beyond kind of the limited assumption that my brain goes straight to when we think of drugs and alcohol. But keen to kind of hear your thoughts around this.
Thanks. Yeah. So, there's obviously, and this is where Rob and I complement each other so well, because Rob comes from it very much from a research and evidence-based clinical, maybe call it clinical, maybe, and mine is just my shared experience through being an ex-addict, and also, from my experience. But my description of it is any practice or thing that a person does that compulsively, that basically, let me just actually, I've just written it down, I'm going to basically get it right, that affects their family and their relationships, and they do it compulsively and has a detriment on their health and well-being, and has a potential to be fatal. And that's kind of my description.
And Rob, there, from a clinical perspective, how do things look through your lens?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the things I'd want to say just before giving you a clinical definition of addiction is to kind of say that, in this country, we have a real stigma attached to addiction, sort of driven largely by a media, and I think it's fair to say that in the general public, there's kind of feeling that addiction is a series of bad choices, personal choices. And so I'd want to say, there's no evidence for that at all. And so my clinical definition of addiction is very much a health issue. And it's a neuropsychological disorder that is characterized by a persistent urge to engage in certain behaviors despite knowledge that they can cause substantial harm and have other negative and far-reaching consequences. So very much a health issue.
And if we look at the past couple of years, this seems to have come up in almost every single People and Culture Club session. We talk about the dreaded C word, but COVID and the pandemic, and that's kind of tied into some of this. And we were having a really interesting conversation, and you shared a really alarming statistic with me. And I think it was 1.6 million people were drinking at levels that are kind of harmful to themselves. How much of the pandemic has kind of played into some of that?
That's a great question. I'd go back actually, Mood, to just that 1.6 million, and that's people who are drinking at a level that is known to be harmful to their health. But I suppose it's worth saying up front that the research shows that there's no safe level of alcohol to drink, that all levels of alcohol will have some effect on health, and we're all different. And so, those 1.6 million are people that are drinking in excess of 14 units a week, and some of them very significantly more so. But you're right, Ali, the COVID has taken a bad situation and made it a lot worse. And the stats over the last couple of years, if we just look at alcohol, I think addiction is such a wide and broad subject area. I think if we were looking at it through the lens of alcohol, we've got some good stats, and there's quite a lot that we know about people's drinking habits, and we know quite a lot about what's happened to people's drinking habits throughout COVID, and some very worrying trends that look like they're continuing. I mean, we know, for example, that people drink a lot more at home. Hardly surprising when pubs and clubs were shut for 31 weeks. But people, off-license sales rose by 25% during the pandemic. And 25%, what does that mean? Well, actually, it's 12.6 million extra litres of alcohol bought and consumed. We also know, a bit about who's been drinking during the pandemic. We know that the number of people whose drinking increased to levels that puts them at significant risk, that increased by 60%. 60% more people drinking at levels that kind of put themselves at real harm. And of that 1.6 million people that are drinking at a rate and a level that can cause harm, we know about 600,000, just over 600,000 of those people are dependent drinkers. And that means they're addicted to alcohol and would suffer withdrawal symptoms if they stopped drinking. And yet we also know that about 82% of those people are not in treatment. They're not in treatment. So numbers of people getting into treatment, very, very small. And that's a huge increase over the pandemic. But I think some of the most worrying things that we've seen during COVID-19 is that alcohol-related hospital admissions up 12%. We also know that alcohol-specific deaths up 20%, and that deaths to alcoholic liver disease is up 21%. That's the highest increase since records began. And to put it into some kind of context for you, actually, in previous years, the increase was around 3%. So it's been a worsening picture, but the pandemic made it very significantly worse. And of course, the research also shows that we know quite a lot about specifically who it is that's drinking. And I think this will be important for employers. We know that employed people drink more than unemployed people. We also know that men drink more than women, and that the amounts that people drank increased with age up until about retirement age, and then it dropped off. We know that manual and entry-level jobs, that people drank higher amounts of alcohol, but we also know that professional and managerial levels increased the frequency at which they were drinking. And we know from some other sources of information that about 30% of people in the UK who drank say that they drank to manage work stress. So we know it's a really, really pertinent issue. And also these increases that we saw during the pandemic, particularly alcoholic liver disease deaths, continue to stay high into 2022. And so the changes that we've seen, and also the drinking at home and the excess drinking, continues into 2022. And so the pandemic has cast a very long shadow, I think, in terms of people's health and the impact that it will have for employers.
And some really alarming statistics there. And, seems like it's painting quite an evident picture that we know that the pandemic has caused stress in all areas of our lives. But one of the, from my perspective, and lots of us from a people capacity perspective, we look at hybrid working or more opportunities to remote working being a real positive. But I'm also mindful that we're looking through that with one particular lens. And I wonder, either Jason or Rob, what your thoughts are. In fact, Jason, we'll come to you first, on whether or not more of that kind of remote working has influenced some of the increase in statistics that Rob mentioned.
I think it really does. And, there are, obviously there's all of this evidence that's out there, that research that's been done, but just anecdotally, we know that, and I know that, certainly in the recovery community in Brighton and Hove, for example, where I'm connected to, is we had a huge amount of people that weren't necessarily, didn't really have a drink problem per se before. They always liked to drink, but what the lockdown did is really amplified that. And we had people coming in and kind of their drinking crossed the line, if you like, during lockdown, where instead of being at 1 o'clock after lunch, I'd have a glass of wine. It turned into, and because it's an addiction, it's an addictive a substance, as in they get a sense of ease and comfort from it, okay, and it makes them feel good, and it becomes a crutch. Is earlier and earlier, and it's quite a common story. Is it was just early and early in the day, that glass of wine or the G&T was coming out, and until some, people were drinking first thing in the morning, But it doesn't have to be, actually, an alcoholic doesn't have to be someone that opens a can of beer in the morning. You know, it's subtle and cunning, and it's a cunning foe. And we just found that over that period in lockdown, people's drinking definitely increased. And as employers, we're not really, I had one guy who was working for me, and actually, we hired people in recovery as part of our mission in the last business I ran. And Rob and I have talked about it because Rob was actually on the board. We didn't know. I mean, for 2 years, and it wasn't alcohol, it was something else, but alcohol was included, is that you couldn't tell. It just looked like someone had a big weekend, and they're coming in a bit hungover on a Monday morning. But it turned out that, it was quite acute, the level of drinking and other substances that this person was using. And I'm someone who I thought I could recognize it, and I didn't have a clue, So I think where we're moving towards, which is this dialogue and this conversation, because he was able to come to me, and I think that's the important thing, is that he knew that he was in an environment where, when it got bad enough, that sometimes it needs to get bad enough, he was able to say, actually, the reason why I'm not performing, Jason, is I'm drinking and taking drugs too much. And then we had we're equipped, right? Semi, I feel we're relatively equipped. So he was able to Rob and I worked closely with him to signpost him and get him some support, and, build a roadmap for him that meant he was able to, at least look at it. That doesn't mean that it's his time to stop or to address it properly, but at least he had a dialogue with me, an open dialogue, to be able to open the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go on, Rob.
Yeah, Ali, I'd just say that you're right, I think, in pointing out, that the way that we work was changed by the pandemic. And it's very unlikely to go back to how it was. And so I think there is things there for employers to be thinking about in terms of how that change to our working lives potentially creates opportunity for addiction and alcohol issues to balloon almost unnoticed. And I would say there's a couple of things. We know from big pieces of consumer research, for example, we know that when we ask people about how they deal with work-based stress, we know that about 33% of people comfort eat. We know about 30% of people speak to a colleague or a family member, and about 30% of people drink. You take a drink. And I suppose two of the big things I would say that's changed with our hybrid style of working now is that people are more isolated. They don't have that regular contact with colleagues, so they don't have that opportunity to, just offload or check in with work colleagues in the office. And the other big thing that's happened, and when I sort of look at people on screen and look at the three of us, we're all sitting at home today. And I suppose the boundary between our working life and our personal and private life is really blurred in a way that it's never done before. And quite often there's no demarcation line. You're not putting your coat on and leaving the office and de-stressing as you make your way home. You're walking straight out of the office into the kitchen or into, dealing with kids coming home from school or whatever. And so working life has become much more of a challenge for people. And I think it makes it easier to reach for a drink and harder to reach for help. So I think social isolation and the blurring of boundaries between work and personal life has had a significant impact. And I think it's something that employers really need to think about.
I agree. There's been so many benefits of those blurred lines. I'm speaking from personal experience here rather than perhaps anything that's research based. But I suppose we look at it through our lens, and we're closed off to the things that aren't necessarily in our immediate world. And Jason, it really struck me where you shared that story of the individual that it got to a point where they really needed to open up, and you had obviously created that safe space for that dialogue to happen. But then when we kind of flip back to that kind of working in a hybrid environment or working from home remotely, where do we even start with kind of as leaders and as kind of people, where do we start with trying to spot what some of those signs might even be?
I think if I jump in on that one, is that I think, you know, just by being here, and if anyone watches this and if anyone, you know, clicked on the link to inquire about you know, about this session, is kind of where it starts. It starts with having an interest in having the conversation, or at least, you know, organizations like yourself, Ali, and Silicon Brighton making the leap to be able to open this dialogue. That's the, you know, I think for me, where it starts. And then, you know, some informed, like, you know, research-based detail and information that helps kind of move the conversation along, and then some life experience. And I think actually, you know, that's where in America, this is kind of, you know, a kind of random anecdote, but in America, you are okay putting a 12-step program on your CV. You know, it is seen as a beneficial thing that you have a 12-step program in your life, and that you know, you've looked at that and you've had a look at yourself and you work some kind of program. And because it's so huge in America, and, you know, I would really, one of our goals is for that to be something in the UK where it's so destigmatized that someone can say, yeah, I'm an ex-addict. But the reality is actually, if you probably said that in an interview, in fact, we did some desktop research recently, and you probably wouldn't get the job. So where I'm leading with this is having someone within the organization that has experience. And I've seen some chat about the diversity within an organization, having the conversation, and then either in private or finding the right space to identify someone within your organization that has experience of recovery from anything. You know, it doesn't have to be drinking drugs. That person probably has something to offer the organization in terms of experience to be able to work towards creating that safe space. So I think that's the start point, and then yeah. So I think it starts with opening that dialogue within the organization, but it starts kind of here. This is where it starts, you know.
And we often say that with lots of things, that taking the first step is often the hardest thing to do, and then as the ball starts rolling, and the conversations that we kind of assumed in our head would be incredibly difficult, not to say that they are easy, but they become slightly more adjusted or more comfortable having the uncomfortable conversation. Going back to some of the signs that we can look for, because, you know, I'm sure most of us on here are not kind of qualified to make diagnoses, but I assume there are some signs that we can look for to help us start opening up some of that dialogue. What do we look for?
Jason,
I mean, I'll start that one first. Should I start that one, Rob? Yeah. I mean, you know, as I say, it's so difficult, and I actually kicked myself a little bit for not spotting this one, because it was in the backdrop of lockdown. So it was all based around performance. So, and I can only use my experience. It was based around performance. It was based around a climate where business wasn't converting. So this is a sales in a sales capacity. Business wasn't converting. There were lots of reasons why that we could find, but actually, when I look back at that, and maybe I did spot it. I think actually, you know what I said? How's it? I think the question I did say was kind of what's going on behind this, because there was continual abnormal poor performance. That was the first thing that we noticed, is that, you know, we kept on having the same conversation, and we kept on having the same conversation, and then it kept on being that conversation happening on a Monday, but then the conversation was happening throughout the week. So it got to a point. So it was, if say, you know, the first sign was continual and abnormal, regular, poor performance against what they usually do. That was the first thing. Absences that are, you know, there was the cat, the dog, and I'm not making a joke of it, but, you know, it was every other thing. There was the thing they're waiting for at home because of lockdown as well. You didn't have the capacity to, I'm just off the phone for a few hours. I'm not going to be logging in till 10, or I'm going to be finishing a bit early, or I'm not about today because I've got an appointment or something, or a classic one over COVID was, I've got COVID, I've got COVID, so I'm not around at the moment, but I can't speak on the phone. So I think that's, Rob, is there anything else that you can add to that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jason. I think you painted a really beautiful picture there of what I would call a pattern of behavior. And that's really what we're talking about and looking at. We're looking at a pattern of change, and small changes, and just to be cognizant of a change in performance, a change in attitude, a change in behavior. But you generally see people maybe becoming a little bit less involved with the team, a little more withdrawn. You definitely see some unexpected and short notice absences, and generally quite short absences, but also mistakes, accidents, near misses. And I think Jason often talked about sort of loading himself up with mints and chewing gum in order to kind of cover the smell. So, I'd say people do, and stuff like that is another thing to look out for. But the key thing is a pattern of change. And again, if we just sort of relate it to, hybrid working, it's harder to spot, isn't it? And I think maybe employers have got a bit of an extra duty during, this change in our working lives to be a bit more kind of proactive and inquire after people's health and well-being, and be trying to spot those changes.
I've just put in the chat, I don't know if you, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, just say no if it's not. But Ian, is there anything you want to, I know that we've had conversations previously, and something that's important to you and your organisation. Is there anything that you think would add to the dialogue around noticing it within the organisation?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a couple of things spring to mind. So, for example, next week I'm going on a mental health first aider course with my firm, which is going to be pretty intense and pretty in depth. And I just think there should be something like that for recovery, really, in organisations, because it's fairly new, I suppose, in some forward-thinking organisations in terms of mental health, and which maybe used to have a similar sort of stigma. And clearly that's being broken down, and firms are investing in that kind of training. So I definitely think there needs to be more training for employees, managers, etc., to sort of spot this stuff. I mean, my experience of it has been, some of my a team member over the years, probably over the last 15 years in two different organisations, has been impacted by this and is still being impacted by this. I was worried as a manager about how to handle the situation, because you start thinking things like, does it reflect on you, and does it reflect on the hiring, and does it, what do you do about this? How does this person, what do you do with this person? But the firm I work for has been so supportive of this, and we've done things like build a team succession around this person, so that if and when they go off, that the work doesn't just get dropped. So obviously, we've got a business to run. We've had, I'm going to use my previous organisation just for confidentiality purposes, but we've had an example where somebody in the team has been travelling because they've got a global role, and basically started to drink in the lounge, then on the plane in business class, and basically got to the destination and didn't manage to get into the office, and we had to fly somebody to bring them back. So the costs of this, and the impact on the team and on individuals and so on and so it is massive. But support is key from organisations. I think having some support and giving them something they don't have to worry so much about the job. They can worry about getting better is kind of what I hope for them. And we're still learning this. I think to your point earlier on, it's easy to spot it when somebody completely falls off the wagon and they're drinking like a bottle of vodka, and it just comes out because they just need serious help. But it's harder to spot the sort of the points that you were saying, Rob, the masses of of addiction, where there's a big majority who are probably drinking too much, and it's probably affecting their work. And that's the bit I'm less familiar with, how to spot that, how to have the conversations, what to do about that.
I suppose, Ian, yeah, I mean, and I think, when I talk to employers, that's a very common question. And I've seen from Alexandra in the chat, about how long it takes for these things to kind of build up, and it can be quite difficult to spot. And that's why I think actually that what we have to do is take a step back from that and start the whole process earlier. And actually, rather than being able to spot these changes, and I think that is important, I think more important is kind of creating a work-based culture that sends health and well-being messages about substances to employees, that makes it part of the narrative, part of the story of the organisation. Here's our view on substance use. I think when we do that, where we can maybe preempt some of the need for those sort of spotting of a problem. Jason, you wanted to come in there.
Oh no, I didn't want to interrupt at all. I just think that this is leading so much into kind of where, some of the stuff that I know that you spent some time with Dame Carol Black and the team with the big, the huge research that's been happening over the last couple of years. And obviously I was invited to be involved in that as well. And what we do have an inkling in is that, and the reason why this is connected is that with the course you're going on here, and we think, or there's evidence to support that in the next not too distant future, it is going to become a mandatory element of a mental health awareness first aid course, and that's wonderful for all of us. That it's going to become, and that's because of the shift that we see based on the evidence that it is going to kind of change. The law is going to be changed in terms of recognizing it as a characteristic under employment law. And that's where the difference will come, is that when that shift happens from in line with where it is at mental health, in line with mental health, when it gets recognized in line with mental health as a characteristic, that's when, hopefully, there'll be a proliferation and a requirement for organisations to have some training at some point.
So I'm going to ask a really difficult question here, because I think it's absolutely a great thing that if this is going to become a protected characteristic.
That's the word.
If we look at some of the other things that kind of fall within that category, for example, people that are pregnant or have had a child and take time off, we know there is still discrimination there. And I can reflect on personal experiences where I've definitely felt discriminated against because of my choice to procreate. How do we manage that then, where we're looking to do the right thing, and I absolutely and fundamentally believe it is the right thing to support people in the right way, but how do we make sure that some of those biases and that discrimination doesn't happen at work?
God, you're going, Rob.
I think that's culture, policy, and procedures and framework. I think it's leadership, consulting with employees. I think it's an organisation looking at this issue together, deciding what's acceptable, what's not acceptable within the workplace, having policies and procedures in place so that people understand the difference between wanting to be supportive and how that will happen, but also their obligations as an employee in terms of conduct and productivity and expectation, and having that communicated in place part of people's onboarding. So, and part of the ongoing discussion, I think organizations need to look closely at their culture. There's still whole sectors of our economy where not only a drinking culture, but an aggressive drinking culture is the norm. And also there's a really startling stats. You know, I was reading that, you know, some organizations where the work is safety critical. So let's take courier companies, for example. And you would kind of think that courier companies would have absolutely solid policy and procedure in place to ensure that their drivers are not substance affected. And yet the Office of National Statistics suggests that about 47% of courier companies regularly drug test their drivers, which means that 53% don't, you know. So it's a massive thing, but I think starting the conversation, having policies and procedures and framework, having leaders that are trained and upskilled and knowledgeable, and making it part of the conversation within organizations is absolutely key to getting it right.
You know, as well, Robin, to add to that, is just, you know, there's something that I've recognised in my, if you like, recovery career, because and in the chat people are mentioning, you know, shame and you know, how do we come forward with this as leaders or as individuals, you know, having the safe space and such like, is that, and I'm going to coin this phrase, it's kind of reverse recovery envy, that where what this does to some people is it puts a spotlight on. So what you get is, oh, well, I'm all right. My drinking's fine, you know, and that could be a leader who has a drinking problem. So when you're faced with kind of those kind of situations where you might have a leader within an organization that is actually, you know, excessively drinking and knows it, but is feeling the shame that we describe and we've talked about, and for that reason has an aversion to you know, leading the charge or to addressing the issue, because it's gonna put a spotlight on them. So it's really difficult, you know, so it's kind of done, it has to be done correctly, and that's kind of what hopefully is being shaped by the conversation now, is how do we ensure that organizations can address this in the right way that is open to everybody, and doesn't make anyone feel that it's too difficult to talk about,
I suppose,
no matter what position they're in.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd want to come in on that, Jason. I think that's an absolutely right point that you've raised. And I would like to maybe be a bit more hopeful, because I've spent a fair bit of this morning kind of like throwing some horrible statistics at you. So I think it's time for a bit of hope. But I agree with some of the stuff that's going on in the chat there in terms of shame and stuff. And what I would say, you know, how we address shame is by as a company, as an organization, is having the discussions to dissipate the shame and take it out of it. But what I'd want to say is, you know, as a nation, we've done this. We've already done this. We've done this before. If we kind of look at the last decade and the narrative around mental health and how that has changed, and how that's gone from being a completely taboo subject to us now kind of recognizing that, you know, it's 1 in 3 people will be affected in their lives at becoming a protected characteristic. And I think as we recognize that addiction is a health issue, as more and more people get involved in spreading that message, as more high profile people come forward and share their stories, more entrepreneurs like Jason come forward, you know, bravely come forward and kind of share their stories, I think we can begin to change that narrative, and we will build a kind of impetus that will move the whole situation forward. And Jason's right. I mean, we've been involved with discussions this past summer with the Home Office, kind of visioning days. They're looking at it. and when you've got government ministers kind of referring, and particularly our current government, referring to addiction as a health issue, we've had, huge employers at that event kind of saying, we want to be involved, we want to support, we want to help, but what we need is more information, more support, more advice, more training. I think the whole thing is moving in the right direction. I agree with what Jason is saying. I think we're very likely to see this become a protected characteristic in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple of quick realities. When I first came into recovery, kind of because of my ego and pride, I needed to find out what other people were, addicts and alcoholics. And there's a video YouTube that you can search, which has all of the stars, the famous people that are in recovery, Leonard Nimoy, Anthony Hopkins, Bradley Cooper, Christina Ricci. And I needed to know that because I needed to think I'm not a street drinker because of the stigma. I'm not, even though I could have ended up being there. And in Brighton, we've got I always say from park bench to professor, I've seen, park bench to professor, lead professor at one of the leading institutions who's in my, in my circle in Brighton and Hove. We've got judges, and all the way down to the street drinker that comes in, at the end of the journey. And a lovely story that I've got is that Bradley Cooper is Brad Pitt's sponsor. Bradley Cooper is Brad Pitt's sponsor and took him through the 12 steps. And that is, absolutely mind-blowing. Love it.
And it's, I'm sat there, I'm thinking, wow, I didn't know that. And I guess that just plays into the fact that we just don't talk about this enough. I've got kind of one final question for each of you. It's almost like an action. What one thing do you recommend that each of us do off the back of this conversation to reduce some of that stigma?
Go on, Rob.
I would say, to go back to your places of work, speak to your HR leads and ask, what are we doing about this, or what can we do about this?
Such a question.
Yeah, I mean, mine's actually quite similar, actually, in the sense that start the conversation, start that conversation, whether it be, over a coffee, even anecdote, I love the word anecdotally, don't I? I say quite a lot, but, even, I went to this event, this week about addiction in the workplace. Actually, as well as the HR person, talk about it around the coffee machine, or talk about it, in the meeting. I'm just a big believer in us spreading this word and carrying the message. The more people that are open about, the more people in publicly, people in leadership positions that are open about the struggles. Like when Stormzy came out about being, having mental health issues. That was one of the turning points for young people, when Stormzy came out and said, I have mental health issues. That's it.
I think a kind of immediate light bulb here for me as well, if we think about, dare I say, another C word being early November, but thinking ahead to Christmas. And as organisations, how are we going to celebrate the end of the year? And, I'm absolutely guilty of this too. I'm going to talk about the next People and Culture Club meetup, which is happening in a pub. And I appreciate that, trying to make sure that today's conversation hasn't just focused around alcohol, but are the Christmas meetups that we're running and having internally to celebrate our years, are they in places that feel inclusive and safe to everybody in the business? So I think that's kind of been a really big kind of light bulb moment for myself too. But thank you so much, Jason, Rob, and also Ian, for kind of sharing your stories and some of those insights. I think hopefully we'll all go away today and be able to make a positive difference.